Hi, my name is Matt, and I'm here to share some tips with you for how to get around Washington, D.C. if you're visiting the nation's capital. So this is one of the major things you need to understand if you're going to visit Washington, D.C. because it's a kind of a big spread out city. It's not condensed like New York City, it's spread out, so it can be a little bit of a challenge to get around. Now, the great thing is there are many options to get around. The thing is you have to use probably a combination of options to get the most out of your trip and to have a pretty efficient trip, because you don't want to spend your whole time just walking around or scootering around. You don't want to be wasting a bunch of time. So you need to have a good game plan and know how to use the transportation. So the first thing to know is the types of transportation, the methods of transportation that you can use. So you can use the metro, which is the subway system there, but they call it the metro. You can use your feet. You're going to do a lot of walking no matter what you do. You're going to do a lot of walking at Washington, D.C. if you want to see the best of the memorials and the monuments. So get used to that idea. The third thing is scooters. So you can use the scooters like the Lime scooters. You can rent those and ride them around. They even have little bikes. I'll go into more detail on those later. Uber. Uber is an important part and can be a very useful and efficient way to get around Washington, D.C., although I wouldn't rely on that. They also have a circulator bus. So this is like a bus that goes around the National Mall. So in case you don't know what the National Mall is, it's a big park area in the middle of the city that has the majority of the monuments and museums that are famous that everybody wants to visit. It's called the National Mall. It's run by the National Park Service. Just a big, huge open park area that's about 2 miles long and plenty wide as well. They have a bus that circulates around the mall that you can use for transportation as well. And then finally, you can rent a car, and I wouldn't recommend this unless you're doing some side trips, but that is an option as well to rent a car. So let's spend some time going into detail on each of these options, and then I'll tell you kind of my rules of transportation when I get done explaining each one. Okay, so the first thing is how to use the metro. The metro, as I mentioned, is the subway system in Washington, D.C., and it's a really nice one. It's clean, it runs well. I mean, it should be a part of your transportation plan. Don't be scared away from it because it's a subway system and you're going to have to learn to do it and all that. It's actually easy to use and very affordable. It's a great way to get around Washington, D.C. So let me just kind of walk you through how to use the metro. When you get to a metro station, you'll walk in and they'll have a little station, a little machine that you can buy a metro card from. They call it a Smart Trip card. You can just put your credit card in there and put a certain amount of money on that card. I would recommend doing about $20 on the card to start with, because you don't want to do too much because you don't get your money back if you don't use it all. So do about 20 bucks on the card, and then it'll issue you a little card. Now, you can also do the app. They have a Smart Trip app. In my personal opinion, it just took a while to set up the app and get your information in there and get your credit card information in there. It really kind of took a while. And then every once in a while, it was a tad glitchy when you had to scan the phone to enter in to the metro. Personally, I would just go with the card if I were you. It's really easy. You just stick the card in your wallet, really easy to pull it out when you're going in and out of the metro. As I mentioned, you don't get your money back if you spend too much money on the metro, so about 20 bucks to kind of get around for a few trips would be a good idea. Also, if you get done with it and you haven't used all your money, stick that card up at the top of one of those machines. So that's kind of a local thing. In fact, when you go to the machine to buy your card, reach up on top of the machine, see if there's any cards up there that people have left behind. You can grab it and maybe check to see how much is on there. But if you have leftovers, you can leave your card behind and pass it on to the next person. Now, as you're entering the metro, you will go down an escalator. And some of these escalators are really long. The metro sometimes is way deep down in there, and you'll go down these really long escalators. When I used to internship there, sometimes I would literally just sit on the escalator and read a book while I was going clear down to the bottom of these things. So it's kind of a cool thing. But there's something that's really important to know when you're on the escalators, is that you stand on the right and you walk on the left. So if you're not going to be walking down the escalator, you need to make sure to move to the right and just stand there, because Washington, D.C. is a working city and the locals are always in a hurry, and they get really peevish if you're standing on the left and standing in their way. That is the etiquette of using the metro, is you have to stand on the right and walk on the left. Okay, once you've navigated the escalator successfully and you've bought your card and you've entered in, then what you need to do is look at the map. So to determine where you're going there, all the subways, all the metros have the name of the last stop on them. So like you need to look at your line and find where your line is, and then follow it to the end and look at the last stop. That's going to tell you which direction to go to find your metro. You need to look at what the last station on the line is. Say right now we are going from the Smithsonian over to Arlington Cemetery. But we're going to go on the one that says Francona Springfield. The blue line of Francona Springfield. So you have to look at the last line. That'll tell you where you're going. So because when you get there, you're going to go on either side of the tracks, and you have to get on the right side of the tracks in order to get to where you're going. So find your stop on the route line and then follow that to the end, and that's the metro you need to catch. You really do need to get to know the map. One of my suggestions here is, as you're planning out your day, look at the activities that you want to do and where they are, and then use Google Maps to kind of zoom in and find the closest metro stop to that area. So that way you'll kind of have an idea what metro stop you need to use. A lot of the times the location, as you look up the location's website, a lot of times they'll say on there which metro stop is their closest stop. Okay, and that's pretty much it for using the metro. It is really important to get a game plan for using the metro. So my friends, when we went there, I took some guys there last year with us, and one of them just wanted to use the scooters to get around everywhere, and I just kept telling him, that's not how you do Washington, D.C. You use the metro to get around most of the places because, for example, one trip, it was only about $2 on the metro, and it ended up being a $10 scooter ride. Don't assume the scooters are a better option. The metro is cheap and fast, and it's a great option. Okay, the next option is the scooters. Let's talk about the scooters a little bit here. So these are kind of exploding all around America in these big cities, and that is to use scooters to get around. And they are a pretty cool, fun option to get around. But there's a couple things you need to know about the Washington, D.C. ones. First of all, there are 5 or 6 scooter companies that operate in Washington, D.C. So there's like Bird and Lime and Spin and Uber and Lyft, and I can't remember if I've gotten all of them or not. But the thing is, each of them have their own app. So you have to download like 5 or 6 apps to use the scooters. Because when you come up to a corner and you see a bunch of scooters sitting there, if you don't have the right app installed, you might not be able to ride them because they're going to be from all sorts of different brands of scooters. So you have to have all these apps set up on your phone with the credit card information so that you can use the app. Some of them you have to prepay and put some money on there in order to use them, and then you're just going to lose the money if you don't use it all. Then, a lot of times the scooters don't work. The scooters get beat up, people ride them hard, and so sometimes you'll go find a scooter and it's kind of beat up. Then if you're with a group, it can be even more difficult a lot of times because you're just kind of hunting all over for scooters so that you can all get riding your scooters to the right place. Then the other thing is, when you ride the scooters in DC, you're supposed to ride them with a helmet, and you're supposed to ride them on the road, not on the sidewalk. Nobody does this. Nobody uses helmets, and everybody zips down the sidewalks on them, and so that can be a little crazy. A lot of the pedestrians get really annoyed by the scooters zipping by them. Another thing to know about the scooters is there are some restricted areas, both for driving and for parking them. So right around the White House is restricted. They don't let you ride the scooters right around the White House. So literally, if you go into that restricted zone on your scooter, it'll just kind of shut down and it won't work anymore, and you have to walk it through that particular area. Meanwhile, you're paying per time that you have the scooter going, so as you're walking it, you're just kind of spending money for walking, really. Then when you get to the mall, you can ride it around most of the sidewalks on the mall, but you can't park it next to some of the monuments. They want you to park it out on the edges of the mall. Now keep in mind, the mall is quite wide. I mentioned it's 2 miles long from one end to the other, but it's also pretty wide. And so sometimes you'll have to park it. You'll have to like drive it out to the street, park it on the sidewalk out by the street, and then hoof it back to the monument to get there. My point here is not that you shouldn't use the scooters ever, but that there's a lot of inconveniences with the scooters, and they actually cost quite a bit of money. So as you're zipping around through the city, a lot of times you have to stop at a traffic light and wait for that. And again, you're getting charged per minute that you use it, something like that. And so it can add up. Another thing is, like, one time we got to the Washington Monument, and you can park it there temporarily if you want to. You can kind of like suspend your ride or something like that, but it still charges you while it's suspended. So it's not a thing to just ride up to the monuments and then spend a bunch of time looking at the monuments, because you're paying money while the scooter's there. So you do have to park it out on the side and then walk up to the monument. There's a lot of inconveniences with the scooters, honestly. So just don't rely on that as your transportation. Okay, the next option is the buses. So your Metro Pass that you use for the subway is also good for the bus system, the city bus system. Now, I've never actually used the city bus system. I always just use the trains and then I walk. But some people kind of swear by using the bus system. So that's an option too. So your Smart Trip card that you get for the subway system, the Metro, is also good for the buses. And then I mentioned that there's a circulator bus. So the DC circulator goes around the mall and kind of in and out of the mall and will drop you off at various points. This is a hop on, hop off bus, and it costs you, I think, $1 every time you hop on the bus. So that can be kind of a cool way to just sit back and relax and go for a ride around the mall and look at all the monuments from a distance. But I haven't done it because what I want to do is see the monuments up close. I don't want to just see it from a distance. It's probably a good idea just to do it once for a good overview of the mall if you've never been there. That's the other thing, is that I've been there many, many times, so I don't really feel the need to do that. But if it's your first time, it might be a nice idea just to hop on it, ride all the way around, and then get off at the stop you want to get off, and then see those monuments up close. Not something I would just rely on, though. Okay, the next thing is cars. So you can do Uber rides here, or you can rent a car. So renting a car, if you're going to stay in the city, I would advise against renting a car. The parking is just terribly expensive. So if you're staying at a hotel, they're probably going to charge you like $50 a night or more to park that car. Plus, you have to pay for the rental. And then there's no parking down at the mall. I mean, there is, but it's always full. You really can't park, and if you do get a meter down there, you can't stay there for all that long anyway. You have to go back and move your car. It's really an inconvenience. The only exception I'll say to this is I visited Washington, D.C. in the winter with my family, and it was awesome. There was parking there because there's hardly any tourists there in the winter. It was early December. It was actually a great time to visit. So I actually did rent a car during that time because I didn't want to have my kids hoofing it everywhere. And there was some parking there, but that was an exception. Typically, you don't want to have a car if you're staying in the city, but you do want to have a rental car if you're going to go out for some side trips like to Mount Vernon, Gettysburg, some Civil War battlefields, things like that. That's a good idea to have a rental car for that. Now, as far as Uber rides go, these can be a really, really nice part of getting around. I wouldn't use it as your central method because it would add up a lot. So if you're using Uber to get to the mall and everywhere else around there, it can really add up. But I've used it to get to an appointment quickly. So for example, I was with my family at the American History Museum and we had a tour of the Capitol booked. Well, we had about an hour or an hour and a half before our tour. And I didn't want to, it was going to take us probably about an hour to walk over to the Capitol to do the tour. I didn't want to do that. So we just hung out and saw more of the American History Museum, and I booked an Uber. And they picked me up and took me over there. 5 minutes, I was over there and ready for my Capitol tour. So that was a really, really good way to use Ubers, just to kind of be more efficient from getting on short trips. Because the Metro, sometimes it could take a while just to walk to the Metro, and there's not Metro stops everywhere. There's like one major mall stop. There's like a stop at the Capitol. Sometimes it can be longer to walk to the Metro than it's worth. So in those instances, for little short trips, I think Uber has a great place. Now, when my wife and I visited Washington, D.C. when we were first married, we walked just so much. It was crazy. There was no scooters. There was no Uber at the time. It was just a lot of walking. And one of the cool things now is that you have all these transportation options to get around and be more efficient and get more for your buck in Washington, D.C. So here are my commandments of using transportation in Washington, D.C. Use the metro to get around the city and to get to the mall. So if you're doing kind of side trips off to like the National Zoo or maybe the Washington Nationals baseball game, use the metro. If you're going from your hotel to the mall, use the metro. It's another thing I suggest, by the way, is you don't have to get a hotel right next to the mall. You get one about midway out. You also probably don't want one way on the outside of the city either, because that's about an hour metro ride or something like that. Just do one a few blocks away from the mall, or maybe a mile or so, and then take the metro to the mall. Just make sure you get a hotel close to a metro stop. So use the metro to get around the city. Use Uber for short, efficient trips. Use your feet to see the monuments. That means you're going to have to walk a few miles at least to get around and see the best stuff on the National Mall, like the best monuments like the Lincoln Memorial, Vietnam, Martin Luther King, Franklin Roosevelt, Thomas Jefferson. Walk around to see all those. Use the scooters for fun. They are fun to ride, but treat them more like fun, not an essential transportation method. The only maybe caveat here is if you had to go from one end of the mall to the other, like the Lincoln Memorial, down to maybe the Washington Monument or over to the Capitol or to a museum or something like that, then a scooter might be a good idea. If it's just kind of like a one trip to get on the outskirts of the mall, that's not a bad idea. And then use a car rental for side trips from Washington, D.C. for stuff that you have to do outside of the city. So those are my commandments. If you want more tips, watch our playlist. I'm also preparing a travel guide for you, and I'm giving you the most efficient way of seeing the mall and some of the most important things in Washington, D.C. So check that out on my website. I'll put that in the description for you. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.